Welcome to the SSI Orbit podcast, a forum for conversations that explore the ever-growing ecosystems of self-sovereign identity. And I'm your host, Mathieu Glaude. Today's episode is called Using Non-Binary Thinking to Accelerate Digital Sovereignty. And really, it wasn't really the planned topic, but I felt like it came up over and over again during the conversation with Rouven, who was really a great, thoughtful person to talk about this with. And for those who don't know who Rouven is, Rouven Heck is the identity lead at Consensus Mesh, and he also acts as the executive director at the Decentralized Identity Foundation. So in this conversation, we start off with some stage setting by covering the topic of sovereignty and operating in the digital world or the metaverse, with emphasis on government's role in the digital world. We then talk about why organizations such as Mozilla, Google, Apple recently objected to the W3C decentralized identifier standard, and does this go against the independence of people? We then move to the topic of interoperability, where Rouven kind of talks about the need to focus a little more on portability, and he gives a few examples of this. We then talk about what's happening inside the Decentralized Identity Foundation, and we talk about some of the cross-community collaborations. We then discuss what are some top-down and bottom-up initiatives that are happening in the self-sovereign identity space and why it's not one or the other and how maybe they'll play together. We then close the conversation by contrasting verified versus verifiable and talking a little bit about where organizations could fit into decentralized ID ecosystems and where they could offer value to the broader ecosystem. Now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Rouven Heck. Enjoy. Okay, so I want to start kind of talking about the whole concept of digital sovereignty and maybe a little bit of kind of an introduction to get to this topic. And based on some world events that have happened earlier this year in 2021 that are quite interesting, and just to kind of go over that, I think in a lot of ways, technology companies today they definitely have sovereignty over their digital space, right? They build the rules, they build their algorithms, they build their data structures and so forth. So tech companies have sovereignty over their digital spaces, whereas mostly governments don't, but governments do have sovereignty over physical spaces, right? Where they're in charge. And then this kind of event I wanted to allude to was on January 6th this year in the US, where a mob of supporters of President Donald Trump at the time attacked the US Capitol in Washington. And what happened in return is the response of that went to the companies, right? Not to the governments. It's the tech companies that were empowered to deplatform the president of the United States at that time. And you could think what you want about that, but that's quite a powerful thing to be able to do. And then you also saw certain platforms like Parler get deplatformed from the infrastructure providers and so forth. Another event, and this is kind of the year prior in early 2020, just to kind of drive the point forward, there was a hack into a Texas-based solar wind system, and there was malicious code that was injected into the company software. And once again, it wasn't really the government that kind of took charge there. It was Microsoft who found out and basically fought back, right? So if we look at kind of the whole digital world today and how it's evolving, like where does the government sit in that space now? Do they matter in the digital space today?
So I think you bring up a few interesting aspects here. So I think without going into a very political debate about like freedom of speech and so on, I think is it already reducing someone's freedom if one platform doesn't operate anymore as your platform to distribute your content? And I thought that's why I think there's a very different perspective of like, what does deplatforming mean? If all the big tech companies come together, that's one thing. If there are different tech companies, as we have different parties who are supporting different political views, which I think was happening in parts. And I think generally speaking, in our digital world, the dependency of big tech or big corporations is somewhat scary, period. Yeah, I think people don't want government to have too much control or other companies to have too much control. So in my perspective of like in which direction we're heading, it will be like a much more digital world. Yeah, and we see this now with smaller things like okay, many people in the SSI space think about, okay, you can log into your bank, you get like your driver license and all of these like very, let's say we're just replicating the old world with a more modern world to make it easier and frictionless and so on. But I see access to all type of buildings, your car, like you access in the physical as well in the digital world will be so much more around your digital identity that or in the metaverse, like everywhere you're operating, it will be digital. So these are often operated by companies. Yeah, when you have your home system, which is Amazon or Apple or whatever. So I think we need to start with the fundamentals, which I think in this case is like an digital identity, which gives you at least the sovereignty of this minimal thing, because you're still operating in this potentially very different environment with big tech. So government's role in this whole thing depends on where you are, which government you see, and like which people, like what they feel like the government is there for. If you look in Switzerland, in the United States, China, and other places, it's obviously quite different of like how the role of the government sees itself. I see, for example, the European Union taking a quite user-centric approach, but it's also a very different starting position for the European Union, because they big tech companies, which are controlling not only the president's voice in the United States, but also basically every person's phone in the European Union is either Apple or Google, more or less, like from an operating system. They all operate on clouds, which are Microsoft, AWS, and so on. You get the idea. So I think the sovereignty needs to, be fundamental with what do people like operate on, and how do governments operate. The problem is it's not sufficient if the government owns now their own whatever cloud infrastructure for their services, if every of the users depending on infrastructure from big tech companies from other parts of the world. So many governments already took a very, let's say, national approach. So like in China and Singapore and others, regulators were pushing, in particular for banking service, need to be in the country. That the data and like the sovereignty is not depending on other people's or other countries' tech companies. So I'm not quite sure I fully answered your question, but I think it is super fundamental from an infrastructure perspective to have the sovereignty for governments, but also for the people in a certain state. And so I think there is this, rethinking. In particular, I think once, the last years, many people in Europe woke up and realized the dependencies of the United States is a threat for at least Europeans. I'm sure this is true also for most other parts of the world. And I think besides China, no other state was really pushing hard against that development.
It's properly said that it really depends on the government. Like if you're talking about like, hey, we need to remove big tech and we're China, you're basically trying to remove big tech for big gov in China. Whereas if you're in the EU or if you're in Canada, which is a similar kind of types of policies, it's kind of like, well, if we want to remove big tech and be so dependent on big tech, we also don't want to inject big gov, because then what have we really done here, right? And then you also kind of talking about being able to access stuff. And you mentioned the metaverse, which is a word on its own that's really gained a lot of momentum this year. I think we're definitely seeing a lot of convergence, right? Even the physical world, access to the physical world is becoming digital. When we talk about maybe removing the dependencies on big technology, do some of the recent, and then kind of looking from the big technology side of things, where they're just trying to, I guess, grow their bottom line, do some of the recent like Mozilla, Google, Apple stuff, that kind of all the pushback that happened against the decentralized identifier, the W3C, is that all part of the same type of story? Like how do you look at that inside of this whole topic of digital sovereignty?
So I think it's a very interesting question. I think the arguments brought up from some of the objecting companies really opened the question, like, what is the motivation behind it? I feel like I'm not sure it's against the fundamentals of like independence of people. My impression is it is somewhat more big corporate tech competitive actions in some form, that some people see Microsoft being quite ahead. And some of the comments made, I'm not sure every listener understands some of the backgrounds, but let's say Mozilla, for example, filed an objection to what's the decentralized identifier, which was incubated or which is developed in the WCC and was supposed to be like a formal standard now. And the objection had multiple aspects in there. One is that it is not clear enough, specific enough to have like better interoperability, which is a bit like behind, like besides the point of what we try to achieve is like many people can develop this methods and they have core principles to be aligned, but let the market see which ones is more adapted and don't tell or don't force us in this process to figure out which of these ones are the ones which are supposed to. But I think the more interesting argument is, for example, the argument about like the energy consumption. So the argument was basically like, hey, DIDs use blockchain and blockchain burns so much energy and therefore we can't support this. And I think, and that's like my speculation as an individual, not as a representative of the, in a form that Microsoft choose to use a public blockchain, aka the Bitcoin blockchain, as the back end for their layer 2 solution to anchor and basically use the Bitcoin trust or the stability of the Bitcoin network to ensure that. And so I assume, and that's more my gut feelings, that there is this aspect of like Microsoft is ahead in that space, and maybe that's something where some other big tech companies don't like this because it could be disruptive to some of the very data-centric business models. If you ultimately see the vision that what you have with a DID, you have a starting point to build user-centric data stores, user-centric services, user-centric many things, and that is obviously not necessarily in the best interest for every big tech company. So it's not unclear, so it's not super clear. It feels more like a competition between certain tech companies for now than a government-related, I don't know, aspect here. If that makes sense.
It's almost an easy argument. It's not that it's not true that blockchains consume power, like the proof of work blockchains especially. Any type of infrastructure that you need to host is going to consume power. And it is funny too, because I think this is an old stat, but there was some stat about just every Google search is basically the equivalent to powering a lower energy light bulb for like 2 minutes type of thing, right? Every Google search. And how many Google searches do you make a day? And how many Google searches happen a day? It's just nuts. So it's kind of like a simple argument, I think.
I think just like, I think maybe I haven't even like made my statement about this energy thing. I don't want to defend, I'm not taking the argument that the Bitcoin blockchain's energy consumption is reasonable or not. I think I don't want to go there. I know there's like very philosophical debates about this. What I think I'm referring to is there are 100 DID methods out there where maybe I assume less than 10, or maybe less than 10%, 20% max are using proof of work blockchains. Many of the DID methods are using other like proof of stake systems, which are way less energy consuming, or even private or like consortia type of blockchains, or even non-blockchains. So I feel like just using the power argument, like you can use this technology or the specification with technology which burns energy is not, in my mind, a sufficient argument to not support like the technical or data structure standard. We could say like this should not be used with proof of work blockchains. Could be a statement which is a recommendation from the industry to the market, but I don't think should stop that we are agreeing on like this specification, which doesn't imply any technical choice.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It's and I don't want to get into the argument of that either, right? So you could look at, and I think generally people in these types of arguments or in any type of arguments, just it's either one side or another without kind of, it's never one side or another, right? It's just you need to look at the positives and negatives and have a conversation about both sides. But leaving that one behind, you said one of, or the first argument is kind of saying not better interoperability. So I guess DIDs are making some of these browser giants maybe a little bit nervous. They're saying it's not better interoperability. I think the whole concept of interoperability is a little not well understood, I guess. There's multiple layers to interoperability. I did appreciate a blog post from the diff. There was a two-parter there, setting interoperability targets. How do you explain interoperability to folks in the self-sovereign ID space? And are there similarities or differences in the way that people look at interoperability just in the blockchain space as well? I know it's a bit of a fully loaded question, but could you give the listeners just a little bit of a better understanding of what are the different levels of interoperability here that we're striving for and why they actually will make our lives better?
Yeah, I would maybe introduce one other term, which is, I think, portability. So the interoperability is like basically different people have, let's say, for simplicity, like an SSI wallet, which allows you to hold credentials and some DIDs and like interact with stuff. So if you and I have a different wallet, we should be able to communicate and transact with each other. So there's an interoperability play that whatever blockchain or whatever DID method you have chosen and I chosen, we should be able to understand each other. I can validate your DID and say, oh yeah, that's truly you, and therefore can start communicating with you in a more trustworthy way. The portability aspect is if you choose to leave your wallet and switch to another one. Yeah, so it's like you're transferring from like iOS to Android. How easy is that? How is it moving like between different type of wallets? And so to achieve portability, we need to have this basically on every layer of the stack, from your hardware.
And crypto brings portability in the aspect that I'm able to move my Bitcoin from one address to another address to a different exchange, but I'm stuck on that protocol.
I was about to say, like, if you think about this, you need to, like, in an ideal world, there will be different hardware manufacturers. Even that is like somewhat complicated these days, but because many chips coming from very few companies, but to have the sovereignty over your identity or digital you, hardware should be your choice. The operating system on top should be then another choice, and then you build the wallet software of some form is something else, which can be different providers, and then on top of this you build different protocols, blah blah, and then you have maybe different cloud solutions, so which allows you to use different devices. And now to achieve that, you can move now from your one wallet on one device to a new one, we need to have not only software which people can trust, and that's where like open source is a big aspect in there, but not only open source, but also open specifications. So what that means is, if the specifications are like, basically that's a blueprint of how to build the software. So you can write this, and if you don't trust it, or other people or other countries, whoever wants to build the software can do so, and just by following this blueprint can build a new set of software in a different language, in a different whatever. And that's, I think, like an important piece in our ecosystem. Everybody talks about open source. Open source does not imply that you can just easily manipulate the software. It also does mean that you can use every open source software freely and build and manipulate it. So the specs and open source are like crucial fundamentals in the space. They should be coming without any patents and anything else, so that there's no, like, imagine some of these specifications have some algorithms or some ideas in there which are patented by one big tech company, and suddenly this tech company could influence and say like, oh, all of these needs to pay to us, or they cannot do this changes. And that's all the things we want to avoid. Like, true sovereignty needs to have all these like underlying like aspects. And then what I typically try to explain people about the portability is like making it easy for people to understand. It's low friction to move from one offering from one company or from one blockchain to the other one. And the things people understand is your phone number, for example. When you have like your phone number with AT&T and you switch to T-Mobile, it's easy now because I think the government set some laws that it must be like portable, that you can keep your identifier, aka your phone number, and port it to someone else. That's great because now there's competition, and if you don't like anymore your telco, you can switch to another one. So there is at least some form of competition because lower friction. But you can only choose to, or you can only move this phone number within one context, aka one country. You cannot move from Germany to the US and keep your phone number. So that's limited, but already okay. Think about where it's really great is like files. You have a file on iCloud and you move to Dropbox, easy. Because files are self-contained, portable pieces of like information, which you can move easily between all of them. You can copy the local, you can copy it in the cloud. That's true portability of like data. And we need to have something which is similar. And then the third example is like email. So email is whatever name at gmail.com. So you're always stuck in this. What you can do is you can forward it to like another email, but this email is owned and controlled from a company. So only if you own your DNS name, you can switch it over and can keep it for you. But with these three examples, it shows we need actually a combination of all of the stuff. You need to be, you should be able to move your identifier, ideally not just in a country or not just in one blockchain or just one context. Ideally, you can use it across different blockchains. You can move your files or your keys, which I think is another very like interesting aspect, because I expect that keys, like your private keys, will sit way more in hardware than it is today. People today in the blockchain space often like you copy this 12 words to another device and then you start from scratch. Like once your many aspects of your life are depending on this, because it accesses your home, your car, and everything you control of devices and access to your bank and all of these things. Not even saying that it might control also your digital assets, which probably will be the case. This piece of infrastructure and keys will be so critical that everything we're even talking about today is likely insufficient. Key management needs to be way more sophisticated, and copying 12 words to a new device is not going to make it. And it's like not the way how I think in the future this can operate. So we need to have this portability and the ability to move between providers, software providers, infrastructure, protocols, and therefore the effort we're doing in our space is, I think, fundamentally important for the bigger goal. Any company could have built the stack 3 years ago and would have worked probably, but it would have not achieved the ultimate goal of the true sovereignty for people.
If we're really trying to achieve true sovereignty, it's all about giving public goods or creating public goods. And I know a lot of the European governments and Canadian governments as well, that's what they're trying to do, at least in offering what they'll call a foundational identity to their citizens. It's very important for them and very much aligned to the vision that everything needs to be open source and open specs to be able to achieve interoperability and portability. Now just moving that forward, a lot of the guests that I've had on this podcast in the past have been from the trust over IP community. And we are involved in the trust over IP, but we're also involved in the Decentralized Identity Foundation. It might be helpful for the audience here that maybe is more leaning on the trust over IP side. They're more involved there. Maybe they're not. I don't really know. But just based on the fact that we've covered more of the trust over IP stuff, what is some of the cool stuff that's happening in the Decentralized ID Foundation today? And the second part to that is, I think we all have the same vision. When I say we all, I mean the different communities that are in the self-sovereign identity space. So with some of these cool things that I'm hoping you could explain to the audience that's happening in the DIF that might make people want to join, what are some of the cross-community collaborations that are happening as well?
Mm-hmm. I think the focus of the Decentralized Identity Foundation is way more around like the technical and the specification side. So like just to maybe super high levels to start with, I think in at least my understanding and my perspective, so I don't know whether and how everybody else in Trust over P would respond to this, is that the technical and deeper protocol work happens in diff, and the focus in Trust over P is around trust frameworks, governance frameworks, like a bit more the like surrounding ecosystem from an I don't want to say top down, but like I see lots of the primitives and the technical work diff is working on, and it's maybe for listeners who might have not heard about this. So the Decentralized Identity Foundation started like 5 years ago, and was really around let's say incubating and speaking about like some of these technical standards in a way that is much, let's say, more agile. Yeah, I think there are other standards organizations which are like what WCC is focusing on web, IETF on like internet protocols, but we wanted something which is identity or digital identity focused and is not maybe as formal. So it was an intention that we are more like the early stage incubation of like of these standards, which allows us to move much faster. So the type of working aspects in there is like this identifiers and discovery, which is often like what the DIT specifications is like the formalized version, but we are like talking about like authentication with DITs and like all these like protocols around this, or the universal resolver, which is like a piece of technology which allows if you do not understand this DIT method, you can go to this universal resolver. It supports multiple DIT methods, and it gives you like a result for the resolution of a DIT. So we have like working groups around this identifier and discovery. We have DIT auth, which was a working group which incubated like that you can log in basically with your DID. This is an example which I think is kind of cool because we incubated it for a year in diff, and then we handed it over to the OpenID Connect Foundation. So it's fine. Like we kind of like, okay, can we just give this to you guys? You continue doing this, because they showed interest to do so, and that's great because we don't want to necessarily own all of that stuff or control it. It's like incubation and then give it to the maybe better place to make it a formal standard. So it depends. Some of the standards might stay. Depends on what the community wants. Then there's claims to credentials, which is really around verifiable credentials is the WCC standard, but people want to like build protocol marketplaces, like all kind of other standards to have protocols, how you ask for the right credentials, share the credentials, like protocols on that level. Then we have DITCOM, which is something which started actually in the Hyperledger community or ARIS world, and because Hyperledger was not focused on any patent or IP protected work, and specifications really need this, based on what I mentioned earlier. So the ARIS community and diff people came together, discussed it at IIW, and then we agreed to incubate DITCOM within diff. And so that was, I think, a first really good step to bring the community together, because before that it was like a little bit like we're doing here, we're doing there. So that brought already like the community got together. Then there's Cytree, which is one of these like technologies like Microsoft is building on. Secure data storage is a big one, which I think the ARIS community works on agents, which is like a more sophisticated cloud offering, which also can sign stuff, operate on behalf of the identity, whilst Microsoft was like introducing a while ago this called like identity hubs, which is a more like a cloud storage, like a more simple way for you to store certain credentials, but it does not sign anything. It does not. So these things became much better because the teams were starting to talk to each other in that groups. So both of these things are still happening. And then we have like wallet security, which is kind of interesting. So there are more and more government entities which want to define a set of rules. Like if you receive certain credentials, what's the minimum expectation from the hardware? Like, for example, your Apple Pay card, you can move them somewhere else, but you need to re-enroll. And if you get a driver license in Germany, there are certain restrictions what you can do with this credential. You cannot just copy it over to like another device which doesn't have any security. So there's this aspect, and then applied crypto. And that's, I think, as well cool, because there was some effort already around crypto in the Hyperledger world. This applied crypto is kind of like, again, as they want to use different crypto primitives to solve revocation and so on. And the same here, I think it brought together the community on really like the more deeper technical stuff on like how do we solve certain accumulators for revocation. So that's the like other ones. And then we have in Div now more and more quote unquote special interest groups. So there are certain banking and finance, healthcare came together, and they want to talk about their requirements and how this could translate. And I think that's a bit more overlapping to what's maybe what Trust over P is doing, where it's more industries talking about governance. Here it's a bit more like requirements on the technical side. And then we have like product managers talking and glossary work. So like Div is fun, like foundation is on the specs and open source pieces. And has like, I think some members just wanted to talk about like some of these more use cases or UX questions came up. And so that's kind of like Div, broadly speaking. We have 300 members now. And I would say there's a pretty big overlap with Trust over IP folks. And that's kind of like, that's good. It's like that's not a bad thing. It's actually like, I think we are all part of the Linux Foundation family. So we're all like in the same umbrella. It's actually even underneath is the Joint Development Foundation, which is the like legal framework which Trust over IP, I think also CCI, which is the COVID credential effort, as well as Trust over IP. So we are technically very aligned on all the like organizational levels, and we're I think, I don't know whether we have already or in the next 1 or 2 days we'll jointly make a statement to the market about the WCC did specifications and the objectives to this. So there's more and more, I think, collaboration. I mean, most of us know each other since many years, and we have all a joint bigger picture objective. I think the main difference, and that was all like the common things, is that a lot of the work is very like technically oriented. So we're like not talking about governance models or legal frameworks and all of those aspects in Div. These are like primitives which we believe can be used in very different contexts. And so it builds just, I think, a foundation for pieces. And then Trust over P, I think, attracted a lot of big tech, government, let's say, I don't know, I call it often top down, because the primitives, top down is like government issued identities, or governments are issuing credentials, they can revoke them on all of this stuff, and the trust mills, because that's the real world today. Yeah. So if a government wants to do this and a driver license, all of this stuff needs to have this context. But there's this other world, and that's where many of the people in Div are also anchored in, is identity is more than a government issued credential. It is bottoms up. People own their identity, can interact with that identity, start building reputation bottoms up. And what I mean with this is like, if I'm interacting with hundreds of people every day, and I'm active in certain communities on Discord and get credentials because I'm a really good dev, I'm a really good, I don't know, marketing person, and I get now attestations and or credentials from other people or communities, I'm building up what I call like a bottom-up reputation. And whilst many people in the quote-unquote more government top-down one are taking current trust models and putting them in a digital world.
You segued into the exact topic I was going to ask, so that's quite funny, because I was going to say, well, there's a lot of top-down strategies that are being pursued, which is why governance and trust frameworks are attractive topics, because it's like you said, you're really trying to digitize or digitalize the current physical world, right, and the current processes and governance frameworks there, which is why I think we're seeing a lot of interest for public but permissioned blockchains, right, as anchors, where you're able to kind of control the governance and implement that there, versus the whole other world. And when I think about kind of top down and bottom up like approaches and like enterprise SaaS type, just for an example, like Salesforce is very top down, you try to push down, versus Slack it's kind of a grassroots movement. People start using it, that goes up. So you have your government that's trying to issue a foundational ID from the top down and really create digitally native solutions that replicate their policies and legislations in the digital world. But then you have this whole Web3 space, which is just saying, you know what, screw that. We could really reimagine how everything works, right? And so then instead of having kind of these public blockchains, but permission governance, it's just completely public and permissionless, right? And this is where I think you described nicely, you have these bottom-up use cases. How do you think the adoption of do they start to touch each other at some point? Like the top-down stuff will start to interact with the bottom-up? Is there a whole world that's just going to be on the bottom-up use cases that's just going to live there alone? Like, how do you see both of those coexisting?
Yeah, I think many people often think that it's one or the other way. I think it is both. And I think there is also governance or trust frameworks in the bottoms up. It's just not explicit. It is like, how would I trust someone from that Discord community? It's less formalized. So what I expect is that we will see ultimately identity is just like a starting point, like an identifier, and it's all about building a reputation. And because the reputation is the thing which reduces the friction to do a certain use case. Yeah. So if you have something where I can go to a company and this company would say like, okay, give me a bunch of your information. And if I just give them a governance, whatever, here's my driver license, the risk for them to give me a certain service is not super low, depends on the thing. Like if you like, how do they know just because they know that I'm Rouven and I'm a legit a person living in a certain country, the risk for them that I'm not a good driver or like might destroy their Airbnb or something else is not, that doesn't tell them much. So the bottoms up, quote unquote, things like if you're an Uber driver, if you're an Airbnb host, if you're building all this type of reputation, but at the moment they're all siloed in the different data silos of Airbnb and Uber and others. So if I build a good reputation with Uber, I cannot go to Lyft and say like, hey, I'm a really great driver because I have a driver license. Yeah. So the bottoms up, like that I have like 100 customers who are driving with me would be so much more powerful for someone like Lyft to onboard me into better, whatever, internal ranking or something. So I believe it will be the combination. I think there's still legal constraints that you must, quote unquote, check that someone has a driver license, but the other aspects will complement this a lot. And so if you're a new member in that space and you don't have a big user base, but you could go and have this, like you can provide a service and without having all this data, at the moment, your risk is much higher and therefore you need to take higher costs because the risk for you, like as an insurance company, all of these things is like, if you know less about the person, you basically have a higher risk that something goes wrong and therefore a higher price. And that's why I think at the moment, if you have lots of data, you can be so much more competitive in many services you're providing, whether it's a bank, whether it's giving you a loan, a mortgage, or is it just giving access to certain services? And that's not the ideal world I think I'm envisioning we could be in. So I think having portable reputation around you as a person, combined with maybe some of the government issued like legal documents, I think it will be the ideal situation for a while. And maybe at some point, the bottoms up is sufficient enough to say for many services that could accept this. At the moment, that's not possible because most services by regulation and by law are required to do certain things. And that's fine. I think there's no big conflict. It's more, I'm way more excited about building up this bottoms up reputation mechanism as an individual. But I think it blends together. And it will, I think the scary part is on the flip side, just because barely anyone in our industry talks about like all the bad things which could happen. Imagine with one click, I could now share my last 1,000 interactions with other people, or every travel I did in the last like 5 years, and I'm entering or I'm coming to a border of a certain country, and the country says like, oh, to enter here, please disclose every trip you did in the last whatever 5 years. And you can decide, obviously, maybe not to go into this country, but it gets harder and harder. So if you enter the United States, they have the right to get your PIN for your phone or scan your device and like, or your copy your hard disk, like lots of pretty scary things. But people decide the trade-off of like coming to the United States is better than like they're not doing anything bad to me, blah blah blah. I don't have nothing to hide, da 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 da. But it is something which, imagine it's not the United States where maybe the governance around in the country is not as liberal as maybe whatever. You get the idea. So I think, and it's very hard to return to that. So once you've given many of these countries lots of these data points, so bottom line is there's a lot of like things which could happen now because it's so easy and low friction to share lots of information that it can have implications which we are not really thinking about much.
I think the bottom-up use cases are quite interesting. I think you come from the crypto space. I come into SSI from the crypto space as well. So it's stuff that we've been dreaming about for years that you're starting to see become more and more possible. One of the things I think about a lot is, and I still think that we're a lot of industry folks are not, at least if we just take for a second the top-down approach, because they're both going to exist. The day that a government issues a foundational identity to their citizens, any regulated industry is perhaps not going to be disrupted, but they have a lot of processes that are going to be disrupted. And if I just take the banking space, for example, a space that is trying to make a lot of plays in the digital ID space, right? That they're noticing that they're threatened, or there's opportunities for banks to use the KYC use case as a reason to create digital IDs. But I think about this a lot, and the day that a government issues a verifiable digital driver's license or passport or whatever that foundational ID is, your KYC use case is gone, right? And so, or it's significantly disrupted. Your current process doesn't really work the same anymore. It's basically done for you. And so when we think about, and just these top-down approaches, organizations need to start thinking maybe a little bit about where do they fit in that ecosystem, right? Because the whole top-down world is going to be changing as well. There's probably a lot of opportunities for industries to become service providers or just rethink differently where they fit within ecosystems, right? So you mentioned a little bit earlier that key custody is a big obstacle that still needs to be solved for. Well, there's opportunities to provide services there. You're talking about risks. Well, there's opportunities for risk underwriting. You're talking about trying to extract data maybe from an Uber or an Airbnb. Well, maybe you have proxy issuer services in between time to facilitate stuff. Do you look at that the same way? Like if we're looking about like the regulated, the physical world, however we want to call it, how should organizations, or how would you recommend to organizations think about their strategies of where they should be positioned in there, and kind of where are some of the opportunities maybe that you see?
I think what typically helps me in these conversations with like existing entities, like what's the ultimate value proposition they have? Like if you talk to a bank and say like, it's not that you need to control like, I don't know, certain aspects of like the user, like KYC is much more than quote unquote just the identifier and the government identity. Imagine, my dear bank, you have 10 years of my history of my behavior and many things. If you become an issuer of credentials which make my life easier to interact with other services, so you, my bank, know how much I'm willing to spend for food, for travel, for blah blah blah. Now you could give like the credit score we get now at the moment from like the Equifaxes of the world is like one number. Imagine you can give me a set of whatever 100 credentials which I can go to and get access to I don't know, certain, I don't know, restaurants because like I'm a high spender of food X. I know that's maybe a bad example, but the core thing is that they sit on data they barely use or can only use for their own internal, let's say, offerings, but they cannot really sell it because I think at least in most countries, there are certain constraints of like what banking information you can sell, but maybe that's not true as much here. But the making this as a business model, not to sell it to third parties, but give it to your users. Because if people see, and I see this, people love Mint because they see all the financial, get all these nice reports. So I know people say, no, I want to pay this with my credit card. So I see it in my Mint. If I pay this with cash, I can't. So imagine now like how people might stay using your bank and do more with your bank because you give them a more holistic score. At the moment that we have like, what is it, like reward points or something as like a mechanism to keep using the system more. But so the bank could get better data, more usage, and could give me better credentials about me. And if I now go to a drive, like whatever, rental car, and can not only show my ID, but my bank gives them 5 pieces of information about my behavior, my type of person I am, my reputation, this is super cool. So that's one thing. Custody is another big thing. In my perspective, I don't want a company to hold all my stuff, in particular if I combine my digital asset and my digital life of every aspect on digital as well as my physical life with my digital identity to enter home and car and other things. We need something which allows me as an individual to pick a combination of custody providers, whether it's like companies as well as individuals, social recovery, all these aspects. So I need to be in control over this. And what I mean with this, like, if you can replicate current world, like if I lose my wallet today, I need to go to the government entity first to get an ID card. Then I can go to my bank and says like, hey, here's my ID card. I now need my credit card back and da. It's not one key to control my whole life. If I have now one entity, one company, so in my mind, we need protocol or like capability that I can choose a set of different custody providers with different level of authority to help me to recover subsets of my digital identity and assets. And that means a lot of interoperability, much easier incentive structure to make sure that I can get them all together. And then the last piece of this is like, what's the ultimate place for like escalation to change it? Like if one of my custody providers is doing something what I don't want to, how can I take the power away? And I think that's something where I believe even there, public blockchains could be the back-end system I trust most. It's the most decentralized, most secure back-end infrastructure. And if I could basically go to some form of smart contract and says like, hey, please remove the power from this custody provider, and they will enforce it rather than like companies amongst themselves. That's kind of takes a bit longer to explain, but like that's like where I believe there's an opportunity for companies to think about, and maybe it doesn't need to be the ultimate direction, but like just think about being a custody provider for something because you have trust from your users. And then what was the third aspect you mentioned? We talked custody, business model.
Yeah, so I was talking about just almost to kickstart sometimes to offer proxy issuing services if I want to extract data out of a silo.
So yeah, I think there will be oracles which can operate of consuming traditional quote unquote data through an API or I don't know, buying data from a credit card company, whatever the source might be, and you can issue these type of credentials, which just means you need to, like, as an issuer of these oracles, you need to have a certain reputation, because if you can consume a set of like unknown information and you abstract it away to like a new credential, then people need to trust that you did that role right. Similar to how people trust now Equifax and others to consume a bunch of private information and abstract it into like one score or like a few data points. And if we, in the sovereign world, we hopefully are getting to is there should be lots of data which is not public and could become private. So if I could go to my quote unquote VC Oracle provider of choice and say, here's the whatever 10 data points of things I received from my friends, or like I have my bank statement value or whatever it is, and I give this to this Oracle, I trust this Oracle to keep my data private, and the receiving side, and then they will issue a credential back to me, and the receiving side trust this Oracle to compute the statement or it's trustworthy. So I think there's this really good chance that we have this middlemans to achieve the right trade-off of privacy with a trustworthy statement given about myself or services I want to consume and so on. So I think that's super cool. In my vision or future, I hope we will figure out using technologies like SGX type things where you have secure compute or some what's this word? Like where you compute over encrypted data. That's kind of the ultimate idea. Like if I can give encrypted data to a service which can provably correct compute a score or credential of this, that's the like ideal situation. I don't think the tech is mature enough to do this at scale, but I think it's super, I think, interesting to achieve like the trade-off of privacy and reputation.
If you start talking about cryptography, is definitely the most powerful thing for achieving privacy and security and sovereignty. That's a whole, I'm sure we could do a whole episode on just that. I just to close, I just want to go back to the proxy issuer services, because I think a lot of folks are they're trying to kickstart digital credentialing ecosystems, and they're seeing opportunities of saying, hey, I have a provider here that could do ID proofing, and I have a provider here that could give me background checks, and they kind of want to act as the middle person for the time being to say, you know what, no one's going to be issuing verifiable credentials from the start, so let me kind of do that. And so I kind of want to combine that thought with, I often hear, and it's every day, confusion over the terms verified and verifiable. And I think over the past years, we've seen there's been a lot of conversation about verified identity. I've also seen a lot of solutions being developed where people just hash certain data and put it on a blockchain, right? And then they talk about it as being immutable and tamper-proof, and it's self-sovereign and stuff like that. So just combining kind of both of those together, how do you explain the key differences between kind of something that's verified and something that's verifiable? Why is verifiable that much more powerful than verified? And in these proxy issuer services, would you look at it as being verified or verifiable? How would you look at that whole thing?
That's a good question. So so I think the verifiable aspect is you don't need to trust middlemans. Like assuming I could go to the issuer who has checked my ID, and they are issuing a verifiable credential, and this will travel, and at some point I, as the receiving party, can check that the issuer really said this, and it's not only the information, but also like I can go and check that the issuer had the signature. Like you don't need to trust whoever gave it to you, because you can go back to the source and verify the information, not only for its immutability, but also like who actually put it there, because the hash on the blockchain gives me timestamping and the immutability of the data itself. So I have integrity over the data, but it doesn't define how and who put it there. You can obviously have a smart contract or something else where only the issuer of this information can add entries into the smart contract, blah, blah. But the power is that you don't need to trust many aspects besides the reputation of the issuer. And so in the case of like a proxy, you would need to trust the proxy to consume input of data. Like in this case, you go to like a non-FIDO type service where people are dropping things and you use the API. You cannot give this information to the third party at the end to verify. They need to trust the proxy with that information. If the proxy can receive a certain set of verifiable representations or credentials, maybe you can have the right to inspect the raw data of some form. And so but I think ultimately there is this trust in this middleman if it does any computation of this and not just gives you a presentation of the credential or like a subset or selective disclosure of this information. I'm not quite sure this captured the verified, because so ultimately the proxy verified the data and then gives out a verifiable statement to the third party, but there's still this trust element of the proxy in between. And it's different if the proxy is just a data store which stores this verifiable credentials and you continue to give them to someone else. So it just changes the trust model. I'm not sure that was confusing or helpful. Please help me to, I don't know, either correct or go deeper. You thought about this more than I did, I guess.
That was great. I think I mixed in a little bit the verified versus verifiable is a topic on its own. I tried to mix it a little bit with the proxy issuer because I definitely see proxy issuer being a valid value add that ecosystem solution providers could do right now to really get things moving, right? But at the end of the day, and then we talked about verifiable credentials in many digital ID communities. I just hear verified credentials all the time, and I think that there is a clear misconception between them.
I think the blockchain space has started to work with like oracles and do decentralized oracles. So you can say like the price feed of whatever the price of one Tesla stock is X. And if you have like 5 different entities who are able to validate this, you can now have a piece of data which is signed by 5 different entities. So in this proxy world, you could say like, if I come and share this information out to 5 different proxies, they could all, like one of them issues a statement and the other 5 will co-sign it. So you don't need to anymore trust one individual proxy. You can have a set of proxies who will all like basically co-sign this credential. In some, maybe technically it's a bit more complicated, but or all of them issue the same credential. But most or many of the SSI use cases are very like privacy preserving. So if you do this and you need to then share it to 5 different Oracle providers to reduce the risk to not trust one of them, then the question is, do you rather share it to the 5 proxies, or do I rather share it to the consuming endpoint, like whoever wants to give me the service? But that's only if the data comes from the user. If the data comes from whatever LinkedIn's API, I think, yes, LinkedIn probably will not start doing verifiable credentials on day one. Maybe Microsoft owns them and Microsoft is in this SSI space quite advanced, but who knows? But let's say I think there is a space for people to say like, I log in, like I as Rouven go to the site and give them access through like an OAuth thing to query some of my LinkedIn data, and they could say like, we can validate through his like identifier that this statement is true and he has whatever this type of whatever work experiences, and they can issue this credential. I think it's a nice segue into this future we were thinking. Ultimately, the hope is that the LinkedIns of the world become the issuer of these credentials, because then you don't have a middleman in between, or that even LinkedIn is built based on verifiable information. And so credentials which I receive, like my work for company A and B, I can basically use LinkedIn more as a mechanism to display it. and they will only show verifiable information. And so once LinkedIn shows it, it is verified by LinkedIn, and it displays a much richer, more quality assured set of data about me than my self-claimed crazy, like whatever life and achievements, which I personally can enter to LinkedIn. So it's I don't know, I hope that makes somewhat sense, like that there is a lot we can do with this new primitive.
Yeah, it is interesting because then you're a couple steps out where you're a proxy to a proxy, which is LinkedIn, to the authoritative data or the authoritative issuer, which would be like an employer or a school, for example. So maybe we start looking at these proxies as more protocols, I guess, moving forward to allow us to get there. But I'll leave it at that. I really appreciate you doing this, Rouven, with me today. It was a fantastic conversation. I'm sure we could go on for a long time, and I would love to do this again. But thank you for doing this.
Thank you for the conversation as well.
Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. To stay up to speed with future episodes, or to catch up on ones you may have missed, make sure to check out the SSI Orbit podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and make sure you subscribe. If you have any questions, comments, or wish to see someone in particular on a future episode, you can find me by searching Mathieu Glaude on LinkedIn or Twitter. Feel free to reach out to me directly and I'll get back to you. See you all next time.